CFA Level 1 presentation on corporate governance. Let us just first understand the big picture. To do so, let's understand the various stakeholders involved when we talk about corporate governance. So let's say that this is the company that we are evaluating. So we want to evaluate the corporate governance of company X. The stakeholders for this, let's say this is a publicly traded company. We have a certain management team. So this management team runs company X. So company / management is often used interchangeably. This is the company in which, let's say, an investor is considering whether or not to invest. The management team consists of the CEO, CFO, and so on, but that's the senior management. We then also have the board. So the board is made up of board members, and we'll talk about this in more detail. But the objective of the board is to oversee the management and make sure that the management is running the company in the best interest of the share owners or shareholders. So the shareholders are the real owners of the company. The board should represent the shareholders in making sure that the management is doing a good job of running the company. And by good job, doing a good job may mean that management is doing whatever it can to maximize shareholder value. So that is the fundamental theme. You've now understood the main stakeholders, which is the board, and under the board we have the board members, the shareholders who really own the company, and typically board members will come from the shareholder community as well as also possibly from the management team. And then we've talked about the management, and we've talked about the overall goal of maximizing shareholder value. So that is the context. Now the definition of corporate governance is as follows. So corporate governance is essentially the controls, processes and procedures which define the interaction between the shareholders, the board and management, and essentially the roles, responsibilities, processes all need to be set up in such a way that management acts in the best interest of shareholders. Now the perspective from this CFA reading is very much investor centric. What that means is this reading is not a manual on what corporate governance should be about and what's good and what's bad. The perspective is very much, as I said earlier, from the investor side. So it basically is a guideline for an investor in terms of what to look for in the corporate governance charter and be able to interpret whether various items in the corporate governance charter are investor friendly or not. And from an investment perspective, obviously among many things that an investor considers, he also needs to look at the corporate governance charter or the corporate governance document and determine whether the various items in there are friendly for shareholders or not. And there has been enough research and enough evidence which suggests that shareholder friendly companies or companies where the corporate charter is friendly to shareholders tend to outperform companies with weak corporate governance or where the corporate governance charter is not very friendly towards shareholders. Charter which is not friendly towards shareholders might be more inclined towards keeping management happy. So we will talk about this in a lot of detail, but bottom line is, in general, we as shareholders prefer items that benefit us as shareholders, and obviously those items which help management operate in a way which maximizes shareholder value. Now the way I'm going to approach this reading is I'm going to cover the high level points I am going to simply take the summary points outlined in the curriculum and give a little bit of explanation. From an exam perspective, I think this is a good starting point and a good basic knowledge to have. Obviously, if you have time, then you should do the full reading in the curriculum or read whichever study notes you are using. So we are going to look at the various important considerations that an investor must take into account. First, from the board perspective. So when an investor is evaluating the board, so remember, the board is the entity which oversees the management. On the board, we have several board members. These board members in some countries are also referred to as directors. So in Pakistan, for example, we generally refer to them as directors. Now, perhaps the most important point related to the board that we must check is whether there is independence. And here is what the curriculum says. We should determine whether a company's board has a majority of independent board members. So let's say that a company's board has 10 members, and if 7 out of these 10 members are from the management team, either the management team or people related to the management team, then this would not be an independent board. From an investor perspective, we want a board where at least a majority of the board members are independent from the company itself. And independence here is a very important term. I'll just give you a few examples. So clearly, somebody from the management team would not be independent. Somebody who is a supplier or a customer in any form to the company also is not independent. Family members of management or family members of other people who do business with the company are not independent. So some of those definitions are obvious, but typically anybody who can benefit from transactions within the company is not independent. So point number 1 is, from an investor perspective, we want a board that is where the majority members are independent. Then point number 2 relates to board member qualifications. Here an investor must determine whether a board member has the qualifications the company needs for the challenges it faces. So clearly, essentially this is saying that the board members need to be competent. The idea being that if board members are not sufficiently qualified for the position they hold, then management can get away with things that are not in the best interest of the shareholders. So for example, if somebody is in charge of the finance and audit committee but has no background in finance, then clearly the management team can probably get away with things that they should not be able to. So this is a simple point and quite logical, that board members should have appropriate qualifications. As an investor, if we find a situation where the board members don't have appropriate qualifications, that is a red flag. Number 3 is authority to hire external consultants. So this means that as investors, we should determine whether the board and its committee have the budgetary authority to hire independent third-party consultants without having to receive approval from management. This is important. So if you see a situation where the board has to seek management's approval to bring in a third-party consultant who is evaluating the performance of the management, that will be a red flag, because if management is not doing a good job, they will turn down this request to bring in consultants. Remember, the board represents the shareholders. Management ideally, or management in theory, reports to the board. So the board should be able to hire external consultants for review and evaluation of what the management is doing. And if we as investors see that the board has this authority, that's a good thing. If board does not have the authority, then that is a red flag for investors. Number 4 refers to board member terms. So as investors, we should determine whether board members are elected annually or whether a company has adopted an election process that staggers the terms of board member elections. So this is a slightly tricky one. Generally, we as investors want terms that make it easier for us to bring in new board members or to change board members. As investors, we don't like restrictions. So by and large, having annual elections is better for shareholders. However, even there are some benefits also to having a staggered board, where if we have, let's say 6 board members, then we vote for 2 in year 1, then another 2 are up for election in the second year, and then another 2 in the third year. So this ensures some continuity of board members, this staggered process. So both have their pros and cons, but if you are to pick if you were to force to pick which one is better for shareholders, then the one where there are fewer restrictions is the one you should go for. Okay, continuing with items related to the board, related party transactions. What you need to do here is determine or investigate whether the company engages in outside business relationship with management or board members for goods and services on behalf of the company. So the idea being that if this is the company and you have the management team and the board of directors, does the company do separate or do transactions? Let's say this management, the CEO is over here and Mr. ABC is on the board. Does the company do any transactions with the CEO where, let's say, the CEO has his own private entity? If the company is doing transactions with the CEO's other private entity, that's an issue. So that compromises the integrity of the CEO, and the question will come up as to whether he's acting in his own best interest or in the best interest of the shareholders. So clearly this is bad. And similarly, if the company is doing transactions with a member of the board, either giving him a consulting contract, or if this person is the owner of another company and the company that we are analyzing does transactions with this other company where Mr. ABC is in charge, these are all related party transactions and there are potential issues here. So the audit committee now, here an investor should determine whether the board has established a committee of independent board members, including those with recent and relative experience of finance and accounting, to oversee the audit of the company's financial reports. So essentially, within the board of directors or within this board, there should be a audit committee which is overseeing all the financial statements of the company to make sure that the financials are not being misstated. So that is our audit committee. From an investor perspective, we should expect this audit committee to be in place, and that this committee should have qualified people who can do their job well. Remuneration and compensation committee. So here, as an investor, we should determine whether the company has a committee of independent board members charged with setting executive remuneration and compensation. So obviously the job of this remuneration committee is to ensure that management is compensated in an appropriate manner, that the incentives in the compensation are appropriate, and that compensation is in line with performance and in line with industry standards. Obviously you can see here that if you have a board that is not independent, then there is a high chance that management compensation is not in line with their performance or not in line with industry standards, which would be bad for shareholders. Nominations committee. Here an investor should determine if the company has a nomination committee of independent board members that is responsible for recruiting board members. So this committee is the one that identifies new board members who will stand up for election. And then as far as other board committees is concerned, we as investors should determine whether the board has other committees that are responsible for overseeing management's activities in selected areas such as corporate governance, mergers and acquisitions, legal matters, risk management, and so on. So essentially, whatever the most important functions in a company are, which are being typically on a day-to-day basis, the company management is doing those operations, but we should have a representative committee on the board that ensures that management is doing a good job. An investor should determine whether the company has adopted a code of ethics and whether the company's actions indicate a commitment to an appropriate ethical framework. So clearly that is important. The next point is for investors to determine whether the company permits board members and management to use company assets for personal reasons. So clearly, if this happens within a company, that is bad from a shareholder perspective. In terms of corporate transparency, we must analyze both the amounts paid to key executives for managing the company's affairs and the manner in which compensation is provided to determine whether compensation paid to its executives is commensurate with the executive's level of responsibilities and performance and provides appropriate incentives. So essentially what this is saying is that there should be complete transparency in terms of what is given to the management team as well as what is given to the board of directors. The next point is that as investors we should inquire into the size, purpose, means of financing and duration of share repurchase programs and price stabilization efforts. So in a good corporate governance charter, these items will be clearly defined, and as investors we can determine whether the company actually does what it says. Moving on to shareholder rights. First, let's talk about proxy voting. Here we need to determine whether a company permits shareholders to vote their shares by proxy regardless of whether they are able to attend the meetings in person. Core point being that if a company, core point is that a company should make it easy for shareholders to vote. So if a company puts restrictions such as you need to be present at the shareholder meeting, or if the shareholder meeting is set at inconvenient days, times or locations, then that is a negative signal. So ideally shareholders should be allowed to send in their votes by mail, and essentially it should be easy for shareholders to vote on company matters. The next point is that investors should determine whether shareholders are able to cast confidential votes. This is important because if the voting is confidential, that makes it easier for shareholders to vote, and they are more likely to vote what they really want when they know that management and board members who might be their personal friends do not know what they are voting. So we want, as shareholders, we want to see confidential voting. We need to determine whether shareholders can cast the cumulative number of votes allotted to their shares for one or a limited number of board nominees. This is slightly tricky, and this you will see again in the equity segment. So let me just describe this in a little bit of detail. Let's say that we have 3 seats on the board that are up for election, and for seat 1 it's being contested by A and B, seat 2 is being contested by C and D, and seat 3 is being contested by G and H. Now let's say that a given small investor has 100 shares, and he feels very strongly about voting for A. What he can do under the cumulative voting mechanism is he has actually 100 votes. Since he has 100 shares, he can vote his shares, 100 shares over here, 100 over here, 100 over here under normal circumstances. But if a company allows cumulative voting, he can put all these together and vote all 300 for person A. And since he doesn't really know much or care much about these two seats, he can just use cumulative voting and put all his votes against A. So this actually is generally good for shareholders, especially small shareholders, because they can have a higher impact. The only thing we need to watch out for is if a given family has a ownership in a company, they might use this to get their way. But by and large, cumulative voting is good for shareholders. In terms of voting for other corporate changes, what we must do is determine whether shareholders can approve changes to corporate structures and policies that may alter the relationship between the shareholders and the company. So this clearly, anything that gives power to the shareholders is considered good. If shareholders don't have the power to vote for other changes, then that is bad from a shareholder perspective. We need to determine whether and under what circumstances shareholders can nominate individuals for election to the board. So again, the point being that if shareholders can easily nominate people for the board, that's a good thing. If shareholders cannot easily nominate people for board positions, that is bad from an investor perspective. We should determine whether and under what circumstances shareholders can submit proposals for consideration at the company's annual general meeting. So again, if shareholders can easily submit their proposals, then that is good, and if shareholders cannot, then that is bad from a shareholder perspective. The next point is we need to determine whether the board and management are required to implement proposals that shareholders approve. So again, ideal case scenario is that shareholders can propose new resolutions, and if shareholders vote a resolution in a good corporate governance setup, the board and the management would be obliged to follow what the shareholders are saying, especially if those proposals have been approved by shareholders. If management or the board has the ability to turn down votes or turn down proposals by the shareholders, then that is bad from a investor perspective. Ownership structure. So here we should examine the company's ownership structure to determine whether it has different classes of common shares that separate the voting rights of those shares from their economic value. So let's say a given company issues Class A and Class B common shares. Class A have voting rights, whereas Class B have only the economic benefit. So A, we should say, have both voting plus economic benefit. So generally this is not good, because this will maybe have the board and the company more focused on these shareholders and less focused on the shareholders who do not have voting rights. So we should look at the structure, and we generally speaking, prefer companies where such a segmentation does not exist. We should determine whether the corporate governance code and other legal statutes of the jurisdiction in which the company is headquartered permit shareholders to take legal or seek regulatory action to protect and enforce their ownership rights. The context here is that there might be some jurisdictions, some states, where the company rights or the management rights overweigh the investor rights. So I'm not sure whether this is still the case or not, but in the American state of Pennsylvania, the rules used to be very company friendly and would make it very difficult for a set of new shareholders to take over the company. So this in general is not good for shareholders. We would ideally like the company incorporated in states or in jurisdictions where shareholder rights are very strong. And finally, takeover defenses. We'll discuss this briefly here because this is covered in a lot more detail in the level 2 curriculum. But the core point is this, that a charter, first of all, let's make sure we understand what a takeover means. A takeover essentially means that if you have a certain company that's being run by a certain management and there is a certain board of directors, so what happens in a takeover is a new set of investors essentially take on a majority stake in the shares of this company, and they then typically would fire. Why would they do this? They would typically do this because management is not performing well and share prices are going down. So the idea with the takeover is that a new set of investors take over the company, get rid of the management, improve the performance of the company, and drive share prices back up. So from an investor perspective, we do not like takeover defenses. Why? Because if management is not doing a good job and share prices are down, we don't like that. We would rather have somebody take over the company, run it better, and drive share price back up. So anything in the corporate charter that discourages takeovers is bad from a investor perspective. Now, what you see very briefly in this curriculum are the names of some takeover defense techniques that have been used. So one of them is called green mail. So green mail is where if management sees a certain shareholder trying to take over or trying to buy more shares, management agrees to buy back shares from this investor at a premium over market price. So this then is on the condition that the investor stops the takeover activity. So this works well for management because they can remain entrenched in the company. This is good for the takeover people because they quickly make a premium, but it is bad for shareholders in general. So we don't need to get into too much detail here. All you need to know is anything that discourages takeovers is bad for investors. So that is it. Again, I went over this briefly. I would still encourage you to either do the reading from the curriculum or to do it from your study notes. But hopefully, based on the general points you've heard over here, the reading will be much easier. And I'm pretty sure that even if you don't have time to do the readings, based on this information, you should be able to answer most of the questions that you get. That is it for now.